The day I came home to find my kid's tree fort torn down, I thought it was a joke. But there was no laughter, just a pile of broken wood and a smug little sign stuck in the grass. Structure removed by HOA order violation of community aesthetics. I stood there, fists clenched, staring at the wreckage. My son, Brandon, had helped me build that thing over 2 weekends. It wasn't an eyesore, it was barely visible behind our fence, nestled between 2 oaks in the backyard. But apparently it had offended someone's sense of order. And I already knew who: Lorraine Fairchild, president of the HOA. Mid-50s, platinum blonde bob, always lurking around in her golf cart like some kind of suburban warden. She once fined another neighbor for having a basketball hoop that was visible from the street for more than 22 minutes. I stormed into my house and found my wife, Layla, comforting Brandon, who sat on the couch red-eyed and hugging his knees. "They didn't even knock," Layla said, her voice shaking. "Just showed up with bolt cutters and started dismantling it. He was watching from his window." "Who was with them?" I asked, already marching toward the garage. "Lorraine and 2 guys in orange vests." "Said they were contractors hired by the HOA. I grabbed my phone, snapped pictures of the mess in the yard, then pulled the HOA handbook from the drawer. I flipped through it, page by page. Nowhere did it say anything about backyard structures being prohibited, only that front-facing additions required approval. I grabbed my keys. "Where are you going?" Layla asked. "To see Lorraine. She lived 3 streets over, in the corner lot with the fake Greek columns and a mailbox shaped like a swan." I marched up her driveway and rang the bell. She opened the door in a silk robe, holding a glass of white wine like it was a trophy. "Patrick Talbot," she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. "Come to thank me for cleaning up your yard. You destroyed my son's tree fort. It violated community standards." "No, it didn't. I checked the handbook. It was in the backyard, behind a privacy fence and under the height limit." She took a smug sip of her wine. "It was unsightly, a safety hazard, and we received multiple complaints." "From who?" "Anonymous residents, and as HOA president, I have the authority." "No," I cut her off. "You abused your position. That fort was on my property. You had no right." She narrowed her eyes. "You can file a complaint if you'd like. The board will review it." "Oh wait, I am the board." I turned and walked away before I said something I'd regret. But the moment I got home, I contacted a friend of mine, Javier, a real estate attorney with no love for HOAs. I sent him the pictures, the handbook, and a copy of the original property agreement. 2 days later, he called. "Pat, you've got a case. That tree fort was within your rights." What they did, that's trespassing, destruction of property, and potentially even child endangerment if your son was nearby. I grinned for the first time in days. "Let's file a lawsuit." Because if Lorraine thought she could bulldoze my kids' memories and get away with it, she was about to learn that some dads don't back down. The morning after Javier gave me the green light, I filed the civil lawsuit. Destruction of private property, trespassing, and unlawful enforcement of non-existent HOA rules. But we didn't stop there. Javier also drafted a formal complaint to the local zoning board and the county sheriff's office, flagging the forced entry into our yard and the use of unlicensed contractors for demolition. There were permits required for any structural removal, even on private property, and those go through the city, not a self-appointed overlord in a robe with a wine glass. I didn't tell Layla everything that morning. I just kissed her on the cheek, handed her a copy of the complaint, and said, "This is going to get fixed." Over the next week, Javier and I gathered evidence like bloodhounds. I pulled the footage from my backyard security camera installed last year after a string of package thefts. The footage had clear audio. Lorraine's voice was unmistakable as she directed the 2 men with bolt cutters. She even said, "Just get it down before he comes home. I'm tired of looking at it through the trees." We traced the contractors. Turns out they weren't certified for demolition. One was a landscaper, the other a drywall installer. Neither had any legal right to be on our property, much less to tear something down. Javier added that to the complaint: unauthorized property damage by unlicensed labor acting under false authority. 3 days later, I got a call from Officer Darnell at the sheriff's office. "Mr. Talbot, we're opening a criminal investigation into illegal trespass and destruction of private property. We'd like to come by and take a statement." When he and his partner arrived, I showed them the footage. Darnell's eyebrows lifted halfway up his forehead. "She ordered the men to cut the lock and remove the structure without notifying you. She never contacted me. Nothing in writing, no knock on the door, just showed up and destroyed it." He nodded. "You're doing the right thing filing a civil suit, but we're also going to pursue this criminally. This kind of overreach doesn't fly in this county." By the next afternoon, Lorraine had a patrol car parked outside her house. From my office window, I saw her standing in her driveway, arms crossed, talking to Darnell. She wasn't holding wine this time. Her face looked like someone had poured lemon juice into her eyes. That evening, my neighbor Hank, retired Air Force, lived 2 houses down, knocked on my door. "I heard about what happened," he said, holding a file folder. "You're not the first she's done this to." He handed me a stack of papers. Formal complaints from other residents, fines issued for rule violations that didn't exist, unauthorized property inspections, threats of legal action over pet sizes and garden gnomes. One woman had a photo of Lorraine reaching over her fence to measure the height of her sunflowers. "Why didn't you bring this up before?" I asked. Hank sighed. "Most folks around here don't want the hassle. They just pay the fine and keep their heads down. But you're actually fighting back, figured it was time to help." We included those documents in our filing. Javier amended the lawsuit to reflect a pattern of abuse and harassment. 2 weeks later, we had our first hearing. Lorraine showed up with a lawyer in a shiny gray suit who looked like he billed by the minute for breathing. She wore a high-collared blazer and avoided eye contact as the judge reviewed our evidence. Javier stood up and played the security video through a monitor facing the bench. The judge watched silently. When Lorraine's voice came through, "Just get it down before he comes home," she winced. Javier addressed the court. "Your Honor, the HOA president acted outside her authority, employed unlicensed labor, and violated my client's property rights without any lawful justification. The HOA guidelines do not prohibit backyard structures under these conditions. Furthermore, the laborers were not certified for demolition work, and no permits were obtained." The judge turned to Lorraine. "Is this accurate?" Her lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the HOA has discretion to enforce community standards, and discretion doesn't include breaking into someone's backyard and destroying property," the judge cut in. "This isn't discretionary, it's criminal." That's when Officer Darnell stepped forward and handed the court clerk a folder. "As of this morning, we've filed charges for trespassing and criminal mischief. We also have statements from 2 other families with similar incidents, and we're preparing to refer this to the district attorney." Lorraine's face drained of color. She leaned into her lawyer, whispering frantically. The judge raised a hand. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm ordering the HOA to fund the full reconstruction of the structure. Same dimensions, same materials. That includes labor and permitting. I'm also awarding additional damages of $7,000 for emotional distress and loss of property use. If the HOA fails to comply in 30 days, we'll begin asset seizure proceedings." He turned to Darnell. "And as for the criminal case, I trust the sheriff's office will keep me informed." Outside the courtroom, Lorraine didn't say a word. She just brushed past me like I was invisible. Her lawyer tried to offer a handshake. I didn't take it. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA's insurance provider agreeing to cover all reconstruction costs. But they weren't happy about it. Apparently, the board hadn't approved Lorraine's demolition stunt. In fact, the board hadn't even met in 6 months. She'd been operating unilaterally under the assumption no one would question her. But now they were. A special meeting was called. Hank and I showed up early. The community center was packed. For the first time in years, residents actually showed up to participate. I brought copies of the legal ruling with me and handed them out before the meeting started. When Lorraine took the podium, the room went dead silent. She cleared her throat and started reading from a prepared statement, but someone in the back shouted, "Save it, Lorraine, we know what you did." Another resident stood up. You fined us for having a pink door. But you tore down a kid's playhouse without notice. Lorraine tried to gavel the room into order, but it was chaos. A motion was raised, immediate vote of no confidence. It passed in less than 4 minutes. She was stripped of her title on the spot. Hank leaned in and whispered, "I waited 5 years for this." The new acting president, Mrs. Gupta, a retired civil engineer, promised transparency, fair enforcement, and a full review of all fines issued in the last year. She also announced the HOA would be hiring a third-party compliance officer, with no personal ties to board members. The tree fort was rebuilt within 2 weeks. Brandon helped the contractor measure beams and pick out paint. We added a rope ladder and solar-powered lights. It was better than the first version in every way. As for the $7,000, we used part of it to build a community book exchange box out front. Brandon painted a sign that read, "Free stories inside, no permission required. Justice doesn't always come fast." But when it does, it's worth every nail, every receipt, and every single second of not backing down. A week after the new tree fort stood in our backyard, taller, brighter, and with a retractable drawbridge Brandon had designed on graph paper, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, expecting a telemarketer, but instead I heard a man introduce himself as Detective Roland from the county's Special Investigations Unit. "I've been assigned to review a few complaints following the HOA incident," he said. "Would you be available for a follow-up interview?" I agreed to meet him the next morning at the sheriff's annex downtown. When I arrived, he was already waiting inside a small conference room, a thick folder open in front of him. "Appreciate you coming down, Mr. Talbot," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "We've been going through materials related to your case. What started as trespassing and property damage has led us into something broader." He slid a photo across the table. It was a permit application, unsigned, but stamped with the HOA's letterhead. The document claimed approval from the city for removal of an unsafe structure. The permit number, though, was fake. "This was submitted to the city planning office 2 days before your son's fort was taken down," Roland said. "But the permit number belongs to a roofing job across town. Someone copied the format and altered it." I leaned back. "You're saying Lorraine forged a permit, not just her?" "We suspect this wasn't her first time. We're auditing prior permits associated with HOA actions, tree removals, fence demolitions, even fines tied to supposed code violations. Several of those cases involve similar forged documents." I stared at the file, each page showing a different name, address, and fake authorization. Roland continued. "If we can prove she used those documents to authorize fines, or to intimidate homeowners into making changes under false pretenses, we're talking about criminal fraud." I nodded, letting the weight of it settle in. "What do you need from me? Any communication you received from the HOA before the demolition? Emails, letters, texts, anything that shows she acted without proper board authorization?" "I'll get it to you tonight," I said. As I left the station, I called Javier and filled him in. He didn't sound surprised. When someone abuses power that blatantly, it's rarely their first time. We might be looking at a class action. Back at home, I dug through my email archives and found 2 messages from Lorraine. One had the subject line, "Final notice, structure must be removed." The other included an attachment with what she called the city's directive. When I opened it, it matched the forged permit Roland had shown me. I forwarded both to the detective, along with metadata showing when the files were created. The timestamps didn't match city records, they were made on Lorraine's personal computer. 2 days later, a warrant was issued for her arrest. The news hit the community like a thunderclap. Lorraine was taken into custody for filing fraudulent documents, impersonating a public agency, and misuse of HOA funds. The sheriff's office also announced an audit of the HOA's financials following a tip from a resident who claimed money had gone missing from the community landscaping budget. That tip came from Mrs. Castillo, who had been on the board 2 years prior before abruptly resigning. She showed up at my door the next evening, a binder pressed to her chest. "I couldn't say anything before," she said, her voice low. Lorraine threatened to sue me for defamation if I talked. But now that she's been arrested, she opened the binder and handed me several old meeting minutes, some typed, others handwritten. They detailed unauthorized expenditures, checks signed without board approval, cash withdrawals labeled MISC, totaling tens of thousands over 18 months. She used it to pay for those columns on her house, Mrs. Castillo said, flipping to a photo of Lorraine's front porch during construction. Claimed it was a community enhancement project, never got a vote, never filed a requisition. I handed the binder over to Javier the next morning. By that afternoon, he'd contacted the county prosecutor's office and arranged to have the documents submitted as evidence. Meanwhile, the acting HOA president, Mrs. Gupta, called an emergency town hall to address the community. This time, it wasn't in the cramped rec room, but at the local high school auditorium. More than 200 residents showed up, some carrying documents, others just angry and tired of being afraid to paint their homes the wrong shade of beige. Mrs. Gupta stood behind the podium, flanked by two members of the new interim board. I want to start by saying this. The HOA was never meant to be a weapon, she said. It exists to serve and protect the community, not rule it through fear. What happened under Lorraine's leadership was a complete betrayal of that purpose. She announced a full suspension of all outstanding fines and penalties issued in the last 2 years, pending individual review. A volunteer committee would be formed to oversee the audit, and all board members would now be subject to term limits and mandatory financial disclosures. One man stood up near the front, Mr. Adler, who had been fined $500 for planting a lemon tree. Why didn't anyone stop her sooner? He asked. Mrs. Gupta didn't flinch. Because too many of us hoped someone else would. That ends tonight. The auditorium erupted in applause. The fallout over the next several weeks was swift. The county pressed a total of 11 charges against Lorraine, including forgery, embezzlement, and criminal impersonation. Several residents joined together to file a joint civil suit, citing wrongful fines and threats of foreclosure based on fraudulent documents. Javier represented 6 of them, and I connected him with Mrs. Castillo, who agreed to testify. As for the HOA, the financial audit revealed nearly $84,000 unaccounted for money that had been siphoned through shell maintenance projects and funneled into a private account Lorraine had opened in the association's name. The bank froze the account, and restitution proceedings began. Brandon's tree fort became a symbol in the neighborhood, not just of what had been lost, but of what could be reclaimed. Local kids helped repaint it again with murals of dragons and spaceships. Someone added a little mailbox to the side, and every week new paper notes would appear inside, jokes, drawings, and messages from kids around the block. One afternoon, Brandon found a folded sheet of paper that read, "Thanks for fighting for us." He didn't know who left it, neither did I. And that made it even better. Looking back, the fight started with a pile of broken wood. But it ended with a community that finally remembered it had a voice and used it. Lorraine may have run the HOA like a personal kingdom, but in the end, she forgot one thing: we were never her subjects. We were neighbors, and we were done being quiet. By the time autumn settled in, the neighborhood had changed in ways I hadn't imagined possible. The HOA was no longer a looming threat, but a cautionary tale. The new board had made good on every reform they promised. Fines were frozen, open forums were held twice a month, and most importantly, residents had started talking to each other again, not just about rules, but about real things. Backyard projects, block parties, elderly neighbors who needed help getting groceries. It was like the place remembered it was a community, not a gated kingdom. But just when I thought the dust had settled, Detective Roland called again. This time, his tone wasn't procedural, it was urgent. "We uncovered some records," he said. "You're going to want to see this in person." I met him that afternoon at the district attorney's office, where a new investigator from the Financial Crimes Unit laid out a set of documents across the conference table. They weren't just related to Lorraine, they implicated 2 other former board members, including the HOA's former treasurer, a man named Curtis Langford. Roland tapped the top sheet. "This is a wire transfer." $56,000 transferred from the HOA's account to a private LLC called Civic Green Solutions. Know what that is? I shook my head. It doesn't exist. It's a shell company Curtis registered to a rented mailbox in Santa Rosa. Lorraine signed off on the transfer. It was labeled Community Infrastructure Improvements in the books. The investigator slid over another file a purchase order for storm drain maintenance that had never happened. This is where things cross into federal territory: wire fraud, misuse of tax-exempt funds, and document forgery. We've looped in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Roland leaned back. We're going to need testimony. You were the first to expose what was going on. That makes you relevant to establishing the pattern. I agreed without hesitation. I wasn't just doing this for myself anymore. The tree fort incident had opened the dam now. It was time to make sure the water washed everything clean. The grand jury convened in early November. I sat in a private waiting room for nearly 5 hours before I was called. When I stepped into the paneled chamber, the air was heavy, but focused. The jurors listened closely as I recounted the timeline: how Lorraine had bypassed protocol, weaponized authority, and falsified documents to justify her actions. I described how the fake permit had been attached to her email, how the hired laborers had no business tearing apart anything, and how the HOA handbook had no clause supporting what she'd done. The prosecutor asked if I had ever received any communication from the treasurer regarding these actions. No, I said. The only name on any documentation was Lorraine's. Curtis was invisible until now. The questions moved into broader territory: patterns of intimidation, the sudden resignation of board members, and the culture of fear that had kept neighbors silent. I mentioned Mrs. Castillo's binder and how it showed deliberate misuse of funds disguised as neighborhood projects that never materialized. When I stepped out, I passed Curtis in the hallway. He didn't look at me. His lawyer did all the posturing, straightening his tie, pretending to flip through files. But Curtis kept his eyes fixed on the floor like the building itself might swallow him whole. By Thanksgiving, indictments were issued. Lorraine and Curtis were both arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement, and multiple counts of forging public documents. The charges carried heavy penalties, including prison time and restitution. The neighborhood buzzed with the news, but it wasn't the same kind of gossip as before. There was no fear in it, just a sense of finality. People mowed their lawns and waved to each other again. Someone hung a banner across the community center entrance that read, "Welcome back, Sanity." A month later, the restitution hearings began. The court ordered Curtis and Lorraine to repay the HOA a combined total of $148,000. They were also banned from holding any leadership position in a residential association for 10 years. Both received prison sentences. Lorraine got 18 months, Curtis 23, due to his role in orchestrating the fraudulent LLC. At the final hearing, the judge addressed the courtroom with a tone that left no ambiguity. This case underscores the danger of unchecked authority in positions meant to serve the public good. Let this be a warning not just to these defendants, but to anyone who believes power is a tool to wield against others. That night, I sat on the back porch with Layla while Brandon climbed up into the fort with a flashlight and notebook. He'd started writing short stories, sci-fi adventures where kids built rocket ships in their backyards and outsmarted corrupt space captains. Layla watched him through the window. "He's different now," she said. "Not scared, just aware," I nodded. "He saw what standing up looks like." She looked at me. We all did. 2 weeks later, the neighborhood held its first winter block party in 3 years. The street was lined with folding tables, crockpots, light strings, and fire pits. Someone had even set up a hot chocolate station with peppermint sticks. Kids ran around with foam swords, and Brandon gave out hand-drawn maps to an imaginary kingdom he'd invented. Mrs. Gupta made a short speech from the front steps of the community center, not from behind a podium, just standing there with a thermos in one hand and a scarf wrapped unevenly around her neck. "No one person should ever get to decide what a neighborhood is," she said. "That's something we build together, And after everything we've been through, I think we're finally ready to build it the right way. Later that night, as the party wound down, Hank came over with a box under his arm. Inside was a wooden plaque with a brass engraving, in honor of the fort that started it all. He handed it to Brandon. For the tower, Brandon looked up at me. "Can we put it by the front step? You earned it," I said, so we did. We mounted it beneath the drawbridge, just above the tiny mailbox where the kids still left notes for each other. The fort wasn't just a place to play anymore, it was a monument to what happens when people stop being afraid. The HOA, once a symbol of unchecked control, had been forced into transparency, restructured from the ground up, and held accountable in court. It no longer existed as it once did. The new bylaws were written by residents, the meetings were open, and the decisions were made as a group. The neighborhood didn't become perfect overnight. There were still disagreements over fence colors and who left their trash bins out too long. But now, those arguments ended with conversations, not anonymous fines taped to doors or threats of legal action. The tree fort stood through winter with a string of solar lights wrapped around its roof. On New Year's Eve, the kids climbed up with blankets to watch fireworks from the nearby park. Brandon came down after midnight, cheeks red from the cold, and handed me a folded note. It said, "Thanks for showing us how to fight without yelling." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about a lawsuit or fines or a crooked board. It was about what happens when one person says no more and others realize they can say it too. And if a tree fort had to be torn down to wake everyone up, then maybe it was never just a tree fort to begin with.